Hello, and welcome to episode 29 of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. So, a couple of little bits of admin to do before I start today's episode, which is the second part of my conversation with John Kurlander. First of all, I want to thank everybody who has bought a mug. Thank you for supporting what I'm doing. It's that classic thing of you may have seen it on social media when you see like a sign and it says, when you buy from a local business, you are paying for a little girl's ballet lessons. Well, quite literally, that is kind of what is going on here. I mean, you'd funding the podcast really because that costs money, but essentially I do have to pay for my daughter's ballet lessons because she enjoys ballet and she needs to do that. So there we go. So yes, thank you to everybody who's bought a mug. If you would like to buy one, you can go to my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, and then click on shop, and the mugs are there, and there is free shipping worldwide, so wherever you are in the world, I will cover the shipping, inclusive in the price. Secondly, I have taken the fairly large and bold decision to make this podcast weekly. I found myself in a position where I have 3 interviews that are all two-parters backed up, and I thought, you know, if I'm doing two-parters routinely, then that's only 12 guests a year, and 24 guests a year is obviously a large amount of guests to keep the quality high. But I'm up for that challenge, and I've got 3. After this episode, 3 coming up that are really special, and I've got more booked in this week. So I think the only fair thing to do is to put it out weekly so that you guys can hear them faster and not have to wait 2 weeks for all these conversations. So there we go. We'll see how it goes. At least you know for the next sort of 2 or 3 months there'll at least be one every week, and then if I start flapping and panicking then I'll go back to doing it once a fortnight. But for now, I'm up for the challenge of weekly. So let's see how that goes. So there will be an episode next week dropping, and I'll tell you more about that at the end of this episode. So there we have it. There's been lots of great feedback about this episode. You guys have really enjoyed it. So we'll just get straight back in. My second part of my conversation with John Kurlander. So I'm interested about the particular time at EMI that Jeff Emrick is kind of known for pushing some of the boundaries of the way that they sort of allocated mic setups and that kind of stuff. And obviously with Abbey Road, they'd just taken delivery of this new TG desk. What was it like for you learning from or watching Jeff Emrick working? And also around that same time, did it feel like things were changing? You know, gear was being upgraded and systems were perhaps being relaxed a little.
Yes, I mean, basically, if you were working on the Beatles sessions, you could, no one was going to come in and tell you what to do.
Okay.
Except the Beatles. And so, there was this new board that sounded completely different. And, to get technical for a little bit, it produced transients that were much greater and sharper than the valve desks, which meant that the way it came back off tape was completely different. And then halfway through Abbey Road, we started on 4-track, which were the Studer J37s. Mm-hmm. We went to the 3Ms 8-track, which also, you've got a combination of a new board with more transients and different tape machines and tape formulas that would change the sound, because back in those days, you had this thing called line in, line out, which was basically what you put in to the tape and what came back. And what came back from the tape could be quite different. Mm-hmm. So then, Jeff would just put his fingers on the EQ or the compressor and not even look at the knobs. That's one of the things that's so different now, with people working on Pro Tools and looking at the screen of what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I catch myself doing it as well. And you say, don't do that, don't look at it, listen to it.
Yeah.
So, it was basically a great experience. And it raises the question of, did Jeff or I know, or George, did any of us know that this was their last album? I suspected it was, but I didn't know for sure. No one really knew. So I think Jeff saw it as, we're just going to make something with a combination of, maybe it's the last album, and the combination that it's a solid state desk, which was completely new to everybody, not just to us, and new tape machines that had 8 tracks instead of 4, just make it sound fresh. And also it was the first album, the only album, that had been conceived in stereo.
Oh yeah, again, another thing I hadn't really thought about. I mean, yeah, obviously previously everything had been mono, so you got all these sounds changing. I mean, how did that affect? Did it affect your workflow, having new tape machines and a new desk? Where you mentioned Jeff not looking at the knobs when he was EQing things, but presumably on a new desk there was a period of time where you had to learn what was going on.
They were fairly easy to understand. I mean, it was fairly basic at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But Jeff would always just, as I said, do things just by listening, and he wasn't afraid to try different miking things, which made it so interesting to watch him do it.
How do you think what you watched from Jeff informed what you went on to do? So obviously you worked on some of the solo albums. You were mixed. Were involved in the mixing of McCartney 1 and lots of other things. Could you put into words? Do you think you could put into words what you learned from that sort of period of time at Abbey Road, that when you kind of spread your wings and stepped up, that what kind of you took from it?
Yes, pretty strongly actually. The main thing. All right, let's work backwards. There's a big thing in the last 5, 6, 7 years, longer, of going backwards. Like, let's get a valve mixer, let's get valve microphones, and get the equipment that they used in the 50s or 60s. And this mic, wonderful mics, and they sound so great, but people are going backwards. The main thing I took away from the Beatles sessions is that they never did that, especially on Abbey Road with this new desk. Nobody ever said, could we get the guitar sound that we used on Revolver? And how did we get that? No, they weren't interested. No one ever went backwards. And it would be, why don't we get a guitar sound or invent a sound that's never been done before? Right? And we don't care how you do it, or there'd be this whole thing, a famous story about automatic double tracking. Mm-hmm. That for quite a lot of their records, the vocals were double tracked. And John Lennon said once, it's so time consuming to perfectly double track something. Can't you invent a machine that does it automatically? Which, Ken Townsend went ahead and invented this thing that did it. Yeah. And we invented other bits of gear, like an interface of how to, on a Hammond organ, it'd be hooked up to a Leslie speaker, which revolves. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to get a guitar to go into that speaker, which required a new box that didn't exist, because it was just a hardwire connection from the organ. So our technical department built an interface box that you could plug a guitar or a mic, so you could do vocals into a Leslie speaker, which hadn't been done before. So it was all stuff moving forward and breaking new boundaries. And that is something from that early age that I never, ever forgot. And I'm sometimes skeptical, like people say, oh, why don't we get that kind of 60s sound? And I have to say, well, because first of all, you don't have everything in the chain. You're never going to have everything exactly the same. Also, you're not writing 60s music. And you're not selling it to teenagers in the 60s.
Yeah.
So just forget about it, get over it, and write something new and record something new.
I love that. I mean, something that comes up a lot in the interviews I've read of yours is your willingness to embrace what's happening with technology. I mean, even just when we started this interview, we were talking about the M1, the new M1 chip in,
That's right.
and that's, I think that's probably something that people will be surprised to hear. That you. Am I correct in thinking that when you first moved to LA, you were one of the first users of the Pro Tools setup? And
yeah, yes, the people here in LA are very, very stuck in their analog ways, in every respect, and much more so than Europe. We had, at the time, there was Pro Tools that had a capability of 8 channels. And it was when I moved here, it was being used for mixing.
Okay.
So things would be recorded either on a 24 track or a 48 track.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would mix down to Pro Tools in 8 track. And we had a very close relationship with a guy called Tom Graham, who was the local Pro Tools service rep. And I was working with a composer, David Newman, at the time. And I said, well, what about taking it beyond 8-track? Do you think we could ever get it big enough? And it was the same time that they were coming up with new interfaces and stuff. He said, theoretically, yes. Practically, I don't know. So what we said to him was, if we tried a session, say, for instance, 24 tracks of Pro Tools, I understand it could be a risk. What if we back it up with an analog or a tape version as a backup, but would you come along and operate it so it would minimize the risks of it going wrong? So he agreed, and it wasn't Avid then, it was DigiDesign. Gave him the time to come, and because they saw it as a good experiment.
Yeah.
And so I think the first film that we did, I can't remember which one it was, but we pushed it up to 24 tracks at the same time as backing it up on tape.
Yeah.
And then, it went on from there. So yeah, I think, I think that old Beatles thing of just move it forward all the time, they'd have been happy, proud.
Do you think that that's been perhaps one of the reasons for how you've managed to sustain such a long and successful career? I mean, you've arguably stayed at almost the pinnacle of what you've been doing for, I mean, even now. And do you think that your willingness to accept new technology is something that's informed that?
Yes, absolutely. There was another story that kind of stuck with me for a long time, was in the late 70s. I think it was either 78 or 79, where EMI at Hayes had invented a digital mixer in 78. right?
Yeah.
And we set it up as a prototype, and we were recording it on, I think, a Honeywell data recorder. And we were doing tests, classical tests, in a parallel control room. And God knows what it was. Maybe it was 8-bit.
Wow.
It was just stereo, but it was maybe 8-bit. God knows what it was. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But the guy from EMI's research came along. He invented this and built this desk. And the senior classical engineer at the time was co-engineering this session, and we had mics out that were paralleled to the main recording in Studio One, to this other room where we were testing this mixer and digital recorder. And the chief engineer, classical engineer of Abbey Road, said, well, compared to the analog, it just doesn't sound any good. Which, like a hush fell on the room. And the guy from EMI's research, who was very tall, he was a big guy, and maybe 6'6" tall, looked down on the engineer and said, it's not that it doesn't sound good, it's that you don't know how to use it.
Brilliant.
And I'm still fairly junior at the time. And I'm kind of, oh my God, this is, it's a real showdown here. And then he went on to explain why you don't have. He said, what you've done is you've taken your ordinary mics that are on the orchestra, and you've paralleled them, and you've chosen those mics, and you've positioned them where it would be the right place for an analog recording, which is what you know.
Mm-hmm.
He said, you can't do that, right? This digital gear has great advantages, and at the moment it has its drawbacks, but you have to work with it, right? And the next test we do, you have to put out a separate set of mics that are optimized and positioned for the equipment that it's signal chain that it's going to go into.
That's interesting. Yeah. It makes complete sense.
And that lived with me also for a long time. And I remember some early sessions here in Los Angeles where we were recording into an ADAT.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember ADAT.
I don't. I mean, I'm not old enough to have ever used one, but I know of them. Yeah.
I think at that time they were up to 16-bit, and they did. They didn't sound that great. And everyone says, oh, if you compare A/B, line in, line out, to an ADAT, it really degrades the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and I said, well, I know the way around this, and that is never listen to the input, because the difference between the input and the output is something that you can't do anything about.
Yes. Yeah.
So whatever it is, it's going to change it. So if you don't listen to the input, you'll never know what it would have been, and just go with the output of the ADAT and then work with the microphones and the positioning to modify the sound to something that you like.
Well, yeah, it sounds like common sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is common sense. the whole thing is common sense.
I think. I was gonna. I mean, it's along the same lines. I know that I almost think I know what you're going to say before I ask the question. But with that in mind, when you're working on, say like a big orchestra or a film score or something, do you have do you have some set routines that you do, or do you just work with what is presented with you in different situations?
I basically have two methods.
Okay.
One is if I've done something that worked out very well, and we come back and like, let's say it's so-and-so 2 or so-and-so 3, which is a continuation over several projects or several games or several films.
Yeah, so we're talking sort of film and
Yes.
movies and things. Yeah.
Yes. So, like touching on the trilogy of Lord of the Rings, we would do a setup that was completely identical over a production time of 4 years. And the setup for the third film was identical in every single way to the first one. And it would just be a case, again, of writing the notes down and like basically doing a total recall of everything, of all the parameters in the room, all the microphones, all the chairs, what people had for breakfast. And just, this is the same thing again. And then the other method I have is, okay, this is a new project. They want, like the Beatles, and they want a new sound. I'm just going to invent something new, totally new. And I was doing this once, and there was on a video game, and they had a film crew from China following me around, like watching everything that and they were going, why are you putting this microphone here? And it happened to be one of the things where I'm being creative for a new setup. And I said, to be honest with you, I'm just making it up as I go along, And so but then if you do that and they love it, and then they say, well, we need to come back for the sequel or the next thing, I will probably just get out the notes and do the same thing, because it's like locked in and it's created. And yeah, I would quite often, and do even now, lock in certain setups and certain sounds for certain artists. And if it works for them, stick with it until they would say, like the Beatles did, no, let's do something completely new.
Were you, through your time at Abbey Road, presumably you were recording orchestras, so you have, you built experience. I know just from the times I've been there, speaking to the engineers there, that they could be doing a sort of rock and pop session one day, and then the next day recording a film soundtrack. It really is that varied, and it's so you were gaining experience that was going to benefit you
in every area.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you? I've read this story of you recording a 90-piece orchestra at 23, and that scares the living daylights out of me. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around the practicalities of miking up a 90-piece. Not even 90-piece, even half that. I can't wrap my head around the practicalities of it. I mean, how does, in terms of almost taking it back round to the beginning, and you're as a balance engineer, how does that work? Now I'm happy for you to be a bit nerdy, but not, you can sort of sum some points together.
That example of the first orchestral session that I did with 90-piece orchestra and age 23 was the engine that was up in Liverpool, actually, the Liverpool Philharmonic.
Okay.
And the engineer Stuart Eltham, who normally did Liverpool, I was working with him, and he said, I can't go this time. Do you want to do it? And I said, but Stuart, that's lovely compliment to pay me, but I've never done anything. So he said, look, write this down. And I got out like a small notepad, actually no bigger than a Post-it. And he gave me, and I filled up this Post-it thing with notes that he gave me. And he said, so listen, I've been up to Liverpool countless times. This will work. Just do what I tell you, and don't get cocky, and don't start trying stuff. So I went up to Liverpool with the Abbey Road mobile unit and my little Post-it thing. which basically had Stewart set up on it. And I thought, yeah, this is, I asked the producer, a very, very nice man called John Willen. I said, how do you feel about this? Because I haven't done it before. And, you're the producer in charge. And he said, look, personally, I don't mind if you completely screw it up. I just don't want you to feel bad, and which was a lie. I mean, obviously he didn't want me to screw it up, but so basically I thought, okay, this is a big opportunity and a big responsibility. I'm just going to do Stewart's setup. I've seen his setup so many times, and I knew together with the notes how to do it. And at that point, there was no temptation to deviate from it in any way.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit like, going back to the other story, it was a bit like Phil Spector's formula.
Yes,
When in doubt, stick to the formula.
That's it. Had you begun to form any preferences in your head about where you were hoping that your career might take you at that point, or were you just sort of along for the ride?
Yes, absolutely. Just make it up as you go along.
I'm interested in how you ended up in LA and sort of, arguably now you're renowned for, obviously what you've done, a Grammy award winning for
I
Lord of the Rings.
After the Beatles, there in the 70s, there was a bit of an exodus in England. We had a lull in the early 70s of original music. And there were a lot of people that I was working with in the mid 70s that had moved from London to LA. So I like growing up and thinking, maybe one day I would do this. And it took, I stayed at Abbey Road for almost, just a couple of months short of 30 years.
Wow.
And then finally decided to try it out. And it was quite a shock, because it was so different here that it wasn't nearly as easy as I thought it was going to be.
Interesting.
And it came with a lot of apprehension and frankly fear that I'd made the wrong choice. But the other option, at the time I was chief recording engineer. We didn't use balance engineer anymore. I was chief recording engineer of Abbey Road. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, well, yes.
So just like jump off the cliff and do something different. Maybe it was that having achieved many personal goals in the 30 years at Abbey Road, it was literally time to try something else. I mean, one of the things that was actually a compliment that I hadn't spoken about much is that I was actually replaced by two people.
Wow. Yeah.
One was a pop engineer and one was a classical engineer.
That makes sense. Yeah. That's a huge compliment.
And I suppose, I also gave them 1 year's notice. So it wasn't like I just walked out.
Yeah.
But I thought that was quite a compliment, really.
Do you have a preference now about what you like doing best, or do you still like variety?
Oh no, I still like variety. Right now I'm still doing films, a lot of video games, which is video games I find really interesting because it's kind of almost, I think, halfway between the record, the music business and the film business. It's not. One of the things I find, people are asking me, what's the difference between film music and video game music? And the easiest way I can describe it is that film music is music that you hear mostly. No, this is generalizing a lot, but it's music that you hear, and it creates a positive or negative emotional reaction. And the number of film scores that you could actually say, okay, so sing me this. So they'll probably sing you Star Wars and something by John Williams, but not, no one's going to sing you, 32 bars of a drone. And video game music is a little bit of that, but it's mostly music to listen to. And, people listen to video game music partially because it's repeated on endless loops over and over and over and over again. But it needs like a good pop record, it needs to stand constant repetition. So I actually find that, well, it's the same, doing a bit of this and a bit of that.
So do you find when you're, this is, just a personal, interesting question from me. So when you're mixing a video game and it has to stand up to constant repetition, that you're trying to put things in the mix that vary things as it goes through. So it's not necessarily boring, in terms of, that's such a horrible word. I hate that word, but you're trying to mix in a way that hold somebody's attention throughout it, like a pop tune would.
Yes, pretty much. I mean, last year I mixed all the music for Ori and the Will o' the Wisps, which was again, it's actually just been nominated for a BAFTA.
Oh wow!
Game. And there was like 3.5 hours of music. Mostly revolving around like 3 or 4 themes. So yes, there was a lot of repetition. And when you're getting up there and you're mixing another cue of what is essentially the same theme, you look at the game and think, okay, so let's throw in some variables here. Because yes, you can't literally do the same thing over and over, because otherwise it would just be a loop, or like this a loop. So just as the composer and the orchestrator would throw in some variables, I would throw some variables into the mixing.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's something I don't know a huge amount about, and I guess it tallies with the with the theme of you being progressive and wanting to work on new things. I mean, it's definitely an emerging market for sure. Do you have any particular projects throughout? I mean, there's probably so many that you could choose, but is there anything that you're personally really proud of from your career?
Oh, that's that's really, really difficult, because you obviously go to the ones that were the most successful.
Yes. Of which there's so many to choose.
There's so many things to choose from. I mean, you go, like sometimes, well, what have you done? And you go, well, the Beatles, Toto, Lord of the Rings, and say World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
Right. And then what else do you want to know? So, but those are because they're the biggest profile.
Yes.
And a lot of the other things that are less high profile, unless I start looking it up on an old diary or something, you just completely forget about it. But I think that, people say, what were the best things that you enjoyed working on? And I think that the answer could either be ones where it was turned out to be a critical success, or the one that turned out to be a market success, or the one that you had the best time in the control room with.
Yes.
and the people who were in the room with you. And I think that those are the ones in that category are the ones that have the best memories, whether or not it won an award or whether it had big sales.
Of course, yeah. Is there any that maybe creatively stand out as something you enjoyed doing?
I think just from a perverse man, I like being very perverse. In the early 80s, when I did Hooked on Classics, right, and I was totally at the peak of my classical career. I'm working with some really, really high-end classical musicians. And I remember one night, I mean, you're familiar with the Hooked on Classics.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah.
Right. And to those people who don't know, it was a collection of classical favorites put to a really, really basic, naive drum loop, actually. And to the point at which it was completely drive you crazy. And I was recording with Riccardo Muti and the Berlin Philharmonic. And after the recording, we went out for dinner to his favorite Italian restaurant. And while we were having dinner, Hooked on Classics came on the music system in the restaurant. And I was just like, just ignore it, don't say anything. And who I thought was my friend, the producer of the session, said, "John, they're playing your hit record." Right? Which caught the ear of Riccardo, who then started to listen to it. And he looked at me and he gave me this laser beam stare and said, "You did this." Total disgust. And there were about 14 people at the dinner table. And I really didn't know what to do, whether to kind of just fall into the floor or what. So I thought, no, the only way out of this is to brave it through, And I said, yeah, well, I did do this. And I believe it's done something like 15 million at the moment. And he looks back and he goes, yeah, it has a very steady tempo.
Brilliant. Oh, I love that story. That's incredible.
Yeah, which was a bit tit for tat, but he wasn't gonna. That was the end of the conversation.
Yeah, I bet it was.
Fortunately, not the end of my career with him. But,
no.
But there was something, as I said, there was something a bit perverse about having worked with so many fantastic classical people, just to find a way of turning it into a hit record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I mean, I studied jazz, and I'm quite, that's sort of a lower passion of mine, but there's jazz equivalents of that kind of thing, and if they broaden the audience, there's nothing too wrong with that.
The one thing that I really stand by in that whole concept of things, because people said, well, it is literally boom cack, boom, and there's and they said, why didn't you put any drum fills or cymbal crashes or have a real drummer or anything? And I said, you're actually missing the point. And the whole point, and this was something that that I fought for the whole way through, because I didn't want any variation to it at all. And at the time, the way I argued it was, this is like you're in your room and outside in the street is somebody drilling the road up with one of those jackhammer drills. And all day long, it starts off, all you can hear is this constant drilling outside. And after about 10, 15 minutes, you don't even notice it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It just, your brain just blocks it out. So I said, if this drum beat is absolutely so mind-boggling boring, your brain, after 2 minutes, hopefully, maybe 5 minutes, your brain will block it out. And what will happen is your ear will go to the classical melodies and the harmonies. And for some reason, your foot will be tapping, but you don't really understand why.
Fascinating. It's a really logical thought process, but yeah, it explains a lot.
Yeah. And other people have kind of tried to copy it and gone a little bit jazzy, or they've made more live sounding. Mm-hmm. And of course it just invites even worse criticism.
Well, yes. So I'm conscious I've kept you for a long time. I've just got the last couple of questions. They're both very similar. Something that I know that the listeners to this podcast enjoy is hearing advice. And I wondered if you were to offer sort of two pieces of advice, perhaps one in terms of, you might have already shared it because there's been a lot of takeaway from this already, but in terms of how you have had such a long career, and secondly, for somebody who's perhaps writing at home or mixing at home, a mix engineer, something perhaps a bit more technical that might, that you think is important in the process of mixing.
Right. I would say, this is something that I have been asked before. Mm-hmm. First of all, the monitoring, I wouldn't listen too loud for sure, and not too quiet either. It has to be that kind of comfortable middle ground, because there's lots of arguments in terms of mid-range and highs and lows balance that are affected by the monitoring level. So choose a mixing level, and then never change it. Don't keep on turning it up and down, but go, and do not, got distracted, don't really try not to spend too long on any given mix. Because it may take you a bit of time to get the routing done and just get all the logistics of it, especially if you're doing stems. But even if you're just doing a stereo mix, get all the routing done, then take a break or even a day and come back to it fresh. And really, if you don't feel that it's coming together in a reasonable amount of time, I mean, mixes that go on for, hours and hours or even days, really, if I'm doing something like that and it's taking too long, I just put it away and come back to it. Mm-hmm. And then start from scratch, because why didn't this come together in half an hour? And then I don't know whether all people can do this, but it'll come to suddenly. There's a great story from a guy called Danny Saber, who's doing punk rock, and he was once asked, you never have the artists come to the mix and you never listen to anybody else's opinion. It's just you and your own thing. He said, how do you know when a mix is finished? And Danny Saber said, well, when I get bored of listening to it, it's finished. Which is kind of like a strange answer, but every now and then it kind of comes back that it's not that you're bored with it, it's that you think, well, that is probably okay. I can't think of anything else. And then the way to know for sure is to come back to it a few hours or a few days later, and you will immediately know whether it's finished or not.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I wouldn't listen to anything too long, or too loud or too quiet. What else? There was another point. Just about. No, I think those. If I remember it, I'll come back to it.
So then, in terms of something perhaps that do you have a piece of advice that you were maybe given or you would pass on in terms of having a sustainable career in the music industry?
Well, the first piece of advice is impossible, because you really do need to be lucky. There's no getting around it, and it's a tough thing to say, but if you're not lucky, if I wasn't lucky, then none of this could have happened. But being more practical, I think that you always, whatever it is, whatever the people you're working with or the music is, you have to enjoy it, even if you're only enjoying it temporarily. Even if 3 months later you can say, oh, I'm so glad that's over, I don't want to do it again. But as long as you actually enjoy it at the moment, because you can't do this either technically or creatively if you're not having fun with it. And I think that my own personal thing is this whole thing of dodging around different genres and things helped sustain that, because you certainly can't do it for this long, just doing the same thing all the time.
Yeah, sustained your passion for it, and I suppose if you're passionate about something, you can comfortably work hard at it, and that's what gets the results is the willingness to spend time and put the effort in. I mean, by all accounts, you put a huge amount of effort into everything that you do. So having passion for something is clearly really important.
Thank you.
Okay, just one final thing I just wanted to end on is a story that I would, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear it. Is it about the time that Paul McCartney asked you what your favourite album is?
Yeah, this is. I think it was on the middle of the Abbey Road album. It was very late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was sitting by the tape machine, probably looking fed up, and because there was a lot of waiting, a lot of late nights. Paul came over just to a little chit chat and said, "So what's your favorite album?" And I don't know whether he was expecting me to say Sgt. Pepper or Revolver or Rubber Soul or what. And as what was I then? 18, as an 18-year-old, and you just out of the mouths of babes, just said Pet Sounds, which really was my favorite album.
Yeah.
And before I got the job at EMI, my 2 albums before I went for the interviews, I was constantly playing with Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper. And here I was with one of the writers and artists of Sgt. Pepper, and actually faced with the prospect of saying Sgt. Pepper, Paul, it's wonderful, I actually said Pet Sounds. Looking back and being honest, it was a pretty close call. And who knows why I actually said that.
I mean, it wouldn't have been a story if you'd have said Sgt. Pepper's. So that's brilliant.
But the other thing was, which I didn't know until I said it, is that it was actually one of his favorite albums of all time as well, and was a great, there was this whole rivalry between him and with the Beatles and Brian Wilson.
Presumably he must have taken it well. Yeah.
My one regret, if I have a regret, is that after these years living in Los Angeles, I've not yet had the opportunity to tell that story to Brian Wilson.
Well, there's still time.
But maybe, who knows?
I've had so much fun speaking to you. Thank you so much. I could feel like I could talk to you for hours more, because I mean, the amount of albums that you've worked on that I'd love to know intimate details on is unbelievable. But yeah, I've taken too much of your time. I'm sure you've got a thousand things to work on.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure meeting you and talking to you.
So there we have it, John Kurlander, and as usual, I hope that you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. He's an absolutely lovely chap, and I can't believe I got to speak to someone who's got Grammy Awards. I mean, 3. Has he got 3 Grammy Awards? Yes. Crazy. Right, anyway, so next week, and I often say next week, and I actually mean in 2 weeks, but this time I actually do mean next week. I'm not getting it wrong. I'm speaking with Jack Cassidy from Jefferson Airplane, which is an unbelievable interview. I mean, as is everybody who seems to be quite high up in the industry. Jack is an enormously lovely guy and so generous with his stories. And I mean, he's played Woodstock. He's done an unbelievable amount of stuff. And it was just a really, really special interview. So I cannot wait to share that with you. And that will be coming next Tuesday. So have a great week. Don't forget, if you want to buy a mug, visit my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, and you can get in touch with me through that website, or you can email me, joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. That just leaves me to say a big thank you to you guys for all listening and supporting this podcast, and also to my good friend Joe Kane for the intro and outro music, and my good friend David Henshaw for the artwork he supplies every week now. So yes, have a great week, and I will speak to you next Tuesday. Goodbye!